few years ago, when I was still a senior in college, I had an experience in the woods that I can never forget. It was during winter break, and Andrew, my best friend, invited me and his younger brother, Eric, to spend a few days at their family's cabin deep in the forest. At the time, I was swamped with final projects and running on empty. The idea of leaving everything behind, even for a few days, seemed like a lifeline. We packed up and drove through winding, snow-covered roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the white expanse of snow. The cabin stood in solitude, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in around it. It was rustic and inviting, with smoke curling from the chimney, but there was something about the stillness of the forest that made me uneasy. The first night passed uneventfully. We cooked dinner, played card games, and shared ghost stories under the dim glow of a lantern. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, it seemed like something moved in the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next day, we decided to explore the woods. With backpacks full of snacks and water, we ventured deeper into the forest. The tall trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. As we walked, Eric found strange symbols carved into the tree trunks. They were intricate and unfamiliar, like ancient runes. Andrew brushed it off as graffiti left by hikers, but I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. By the time we decided to head back, the sun was already setting. The woods grew darker, and the path to the cabin felt unfamiliar, as if the forest itself had shifted. Eric asked if we were going the right way, his voice tinged with uncertainty, but Andrew and I could only offer hesitant reassurances. My phone had no signal, leaving us with no choice but to press on and hope for the best. That was when we first heard it. A faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with every step. My heart raced as the whispering gave way to low, guttural laughter, echoing through the trees. The fear was palpable as we quickened our pace, my senses hyper-aware of every sound and movement around us. When we finally stumbled upon the cabin, darkness had already fallen. We locked the doors and windows, pulling the curtains tight. Andrew tried to keep us calm, insisting it was probably just animals or pranksters. But I could feel the tension thick in the air. Sleep didn't come easily that night. In the dead of night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening as they circled the house. The whispering returned, clearer this time, almost human, but distorted, like voices submerged underwater. Eric woke up too, clutching a flashlight as he stared wide-eyed at the door. The rattling started suddenly, the front door shaking violently as if someone was trying to force it open. My stomach knotted in terror as we huddled together, the noise finally giving way to an eerie silence. Moments later, the windows began to shake one by one. The whispering turned to guttural growls, and I couldn't resist the urge to peek out from a small crack in the curtains. What I saw froze me in place. Standing in the clearing was a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes. Its pale, skeletal face seemed to be staring directly at me. I felt an icy dread wash over me as I turned back to Andrew and Eric. We couldn't stay there any longer. Grabbing what little we could, we made a dash for the car parked just a few yards away. The whispers grew deafening as we ran, and I felt the figure's presence closing in behind us. I didn't dare look back. Andrew fumbled with the keys as we reached the car, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped down the narrow dirt road. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Even as we left it behind, the memory of its gaze burned into my mind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we reported the incident to the local authorities. Predictably, no one believed us. When we returned to the cabin the next day to retrieve our belongings, it was eerily empty. The strange symbols Eric had found earlier were now carved into the walls of the cabin. After that, no one ever stayed in that cabin again. When I was a child, I used to go hunting with my father at the edge of the forest near our home. The mornings would often be filled with the crisp scent of pine, the rustling of leaves underfoot, and the distant chirping of birds, all blending into a symphony of nature. My father was an excellent marksman, and he often brought home a bounty of game. I cherished these trips. They were our bonding time, filled with stories and laughter. One day, my father decided we should venture to a different forest, about 50 miles from home. We set off in the late afternoon, when warm rays of sunlight still filtered through the treetops, casting golden patterns on the forest floor. By the time we arrived, the light was beginning to soften, bathing the woods in a serene glow. The air carried the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss, a blend of familiarity and mystery. We entered the forest, rifles in hand, walking silently through the undergrowth. My father was focused, scanning the trees and bushes for any signs of movement. After about an hour, he spotted a small squirrel darting between the branches. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and the squirrel fell to the ground but wasn't dead. It scurried into the woods, leaving a trail of blood behind. "We'll track it," my father said, his voice calm and steady. We followed the trail of blood deeper into the forest. But soon, something strange happened. The blood trail split into two distinct paths. My father and I exchanged confused looks. "You take the left," he said. "I'll go right. We'll meet back here in 20 minutes." I nodded and started down the left path. The forest grew darker as I walked, the thick canopy above blocking out what little light remained. The sound of my footsteps crunching on leaves seemed unnaturally loud. I tried to focus on the blood trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure darting between the trees in the distance. It moved quickly, too quickly to be human. My heart began to race as I quickened my pace. The trail of blood led me further into the woods, but the figure was always just at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, my rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. I turned back to the trail, only to find that it had disappeared. The blood was gone, and so was the figure. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me felt different, almost alive. The trees seemed to lean closer with every step I took, their branches intertwining into eerie shapes that blocked the sky. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, as if the forest itself was watching. The air felt dense, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, wrapping around me like an invisible weight. The trees seemed closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The air was heavy, suffocating. And then I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural like a voice carried on the wind. "Leave." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper came again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the forest. I turned in circles, my rifle shaking in my hands. The shadowy figure reappeared, closer this time. Its form was indistinct, more like a mass of darkness than a person. But its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the gloom. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care about the trail or where I was going. I just wanted to get away. As I ran, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees twisted and loomed, their branches clawing at my clothes. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. And then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. My father was there, standing with his rifle, looking just as panicked as I felt. "We need to leave now," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't ask questions. We ran together, retracing our steps back to the car. The forest felt like it was pushing us out, the air growing colder and the whispers fading as we reached the edge. When we finally burst out onto the dirt road, we didn't stop until we were inside the car, doors locked. We drove home in silence, neither of us daring to speak about what had happened. But I knew my father had seen something too. The look in his eyes was one of pure fear, a look I had never seen before and hoped to never see again. Later on, a few people I met in the town near that forest shared similar stories with me. To this day, I still don't know what that shadowy figure was or why it was watching me. But I do know one thing. I will never set foot in those woods again.